The morning light spilled through the tall windows of the Evans suburban home, casting golden streaks across the polished hardwood floors. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee lingered in the air, mingling with the faint scent of lavender from the candles Lena insisted on buying, but rarely lit. It was a picturesque setting, a snapshot of domestic tranquility. But beneath the polished surface, cracks spiderwebbed unseen, waiting for the slightest pressure to shatter it all. James Evans sat at the breakfast table, a man wrapped in routine. His dark hair was flecked with the faintest traces of gray, but it suited him, a testament to years of hard work and wisdom earned. A successful architect, James had designed homes far grander than his own. Yet it was this house he took the most pride in, not because of its structure or aesthetics, but because of the life he believed he'd built within its walls. He glanced over the rim of his coffee mug, eyes resting on Lena. She was the kind of beautiful that turned heads without trying, high cheekbones, sharp green eyes that seemed to glow when she laughed, and a smile that had once melted his heart. But now, that smile was rare, and when it appeared, it never quite reached her eyes. She sat across from him, scrolling through her phone, her expression distant, her lips curved into a small, secretive smirk. James cleared his throat softly. "Morning, babe," he said, folding the newspaper neatly and setting it aside. "I was thinking we could try that new Italian place downtown tonight. It's been a while since we had a proper date." Lena didn't look up immediately. Her thumb flicked lazily across the screen, scrolling past something that made her smirk widen, just a fraction. Yeah, maybe," she replied absent-mindedly, not bothering to meet his gaze. James forced a smile, the warmth in his chest cooling slightly. It wasn't the first time she'd responded like that, brushing off his attempts to connect. But he'd always told himself marriages had seasons. This was just a rough patch. They'd weathered storms before. Still, something gnawed at the edges of his mind. "I know work's been crazy lately," he continued, trying to keep his tone light, "but I've missed us. Thought we could catch up, you know? Just the two of us." Lena finally glanced up, her eyes sharp and unreadable. She chuckled softly, but there was no warmth in it. "Catch up? We live together, James. What's there to catch up on?" James felt the sting beneath her casual words, hidden like a blade in velvet. He laughed too, a forced, hollow sound trying to shake off the unease. "Fair point," he said, sipping his coffee, though it had gone lukewarm. Lena stood up, stretching lazily, her silk robe slipping slightly off one shoulder. James's eyes followed her, the curve of her neck, the casual grace he'd always admired. She was still the woman he'd fallen in love with, or so he tried to believe. "I've got errands to run," she said, her tone breezy as she headed toward the hallway. "Maybe I'll call you later." "Maybe," James echoed softly, watching her disappear around the corner. James sat in his office, papers spread out before him, blueprints half finished. But his mind wasn't on his work. He stared out the window, the city skyline sprawling in the distance, and wondered when things had shifted. When Lena had gone from being his partner to a stranger sitting across the breakfast table. His phone buzzed, a message from Lena. "Going out tonight. Don't wait up." No heart emoji. No kiss. Just cold words on a screen. James frowned, fingers hovering over the keyboard before he typed back. "Where are you going?" No reply. Hours passed. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across their empty house. James's dinner sat untouched on the counter, the Italian restaurant reservation forgotten. His chest felt tight, but he couldn't name the feeling. Was it worry? Suspicion? Or something worse? At midnight, he heard the front door creak open. Lena walked in, her hair slightly tousled, the faint scent of unfamiliar cologne clinging to her. She didn't seem surprised to see him sitting there, waiting. James stood, his voice low but steady. "Where were you?" Lena arched an eyebrow, slipping off her heels with deliberate slowness. "Out? With who?" She didn't answer immediately, just smiled, a slow, smug curve of her lips. "You know what, James?" she said, her tone dripping with condescension. "I'm done pretending. Babes, I'm going on a date with my new lover." James stared at her, the words punching the air out of his lungs. "Excuse me? What nonsense is this?" You're not going anywhere. Lena laughed, a sharp, bitter sound that echoed in the hollow spaces between them. Oh, sorry, loser, but I promised him a wild night. She turned toward the stairs, unbothered, unaffected. James's voice dropped, cold and final. Walk out that door, Lena, and our 25 years of marriage is over. She paused, her hand on the banister, then glanced back with a smirk. You're so dramatic, James. You'll get over it. And she walked out. James stood frozen for a long time, staring at the door she'd just closed behind her. No shouting, no tears, just silence. The kind of silence that settles deep into your bones. But something shifted in him that night. The man who sat down at the breakfast table that morning, loving, hopeful, naive, was gone. And in his place was someone else. Someone who was about to show Lena Evans exactly what she'd lost. The house was shrouded in an eerie stillness, the kind that settles right before a storm tears the sky apart. James sat alone in the dimly lit living room, the soft ticking of the antique clock on the mantel, the only sound breaking through the oppressive quiet. The amber glow from the table lamp cast long, sharp shadows across the walls, turning their family portraits into distant echoes of a life that suddenly felt foreign. He stared at the untouched dinner he'd prepared hours ago, pasta gone cold, the wine losing its flavor in the open air. The reservation he'd made at the Italian restaurant downtown had long since expired. His phone call to cancel met with polite indifference from a stranger who didn't know the world was cracking beneath his feet. Where was she? His chest tightened with every passing minute, his mind racing through possibilities he didn't want to consider. Lena hadn't answered his texts. She'd left the house with nothing more than a flippant message. Going out tonight? Don't wait up. But James waited anyway. The front door creaked open at exactly 12:37 a.m. James didn't rise from his chair, his body rigid, fists clenched on the armrests. Lena strolled in, her high heels clicking against the floor like a metronome counting down to disaster. She was breathtaking as always, red lipstick slightly smudged, her silk blouse unbuttoned just enough to suggest carelessness rather than style. The faint trace of unfamiliar cologne clung to her like a ghost, sharp and bitter. She didn't expect him to be there. Oh, she said, pausing mid-step. Then she smiled, casual, smug, as if she'd just returned from coffee with an old friend. Didn't think you'd be up? James's voice was low, but there was an edge to it, like steel under velvet. Where were you, Lena? She shrugged, tossing her purse onto the side table with an exaggerated flick of her wrist. Out? With who? His jaw tightened, the question hanging between them like a loaded gun. Lena tilted her head slightly, studying him with that same indifferent gaze she'd perfected over the years. But tonight, there was something more, an undercurrent of cruelty. Why do you care, James? It's not like we're teenagers. I don't need to report to you. James stood slowly, his towering frame casting a long shadow over the room. His eyes, once warm and full of affection, were sharp now, piercing. Answer the question. Lena sighed dramatically, as if he were exhausting her with his petty concerns. Then she smiled again, but this time it was different, colder, sharper, the kind of smile designed to wound. Babes, she said, her voice dripping with condescension. I'm going on a date with my new lover. The words hit him like a slap, but James didn't flinch. His heart raced, but his face remained a mask, controlled, unreadable. Excuse me? His voice was a low growl now, disbelief wrapped in ice. What nonsense is this? You're not going anywhere. Lena laughed, not the soft, genuine laugh he'd fallen in love with, but something brittle and sharp like glass breaking. Oh, sorry, loser, but I promised him a wild night, she said, brushing past him like he was nothing more than a piece of furniture. James reached out, his hand wrapping gently, but firmly, around her wrist. Not enough to hurt, but enough to make her stop. She turned slowly, her green eyes flashing with defiance. His voice was calm, dangerously calm. Walk out that door, Lena, and our 25 years of marriage is over. For a brief moment, their eyes locked. Maybe she saw something in his gaze, something she didn't expect. Not desperation, not pleading, just cold, hard finality. Then she smirked, yanking her wrist free. "You're so dramatic, James. You'll get over it." And with that, she turned and walked out. No hesitation, no second glance. The door clicked shut behind her with a quiet finality that echoed louder than any slam. James stood there for a long time, staring at the door, his mind blank. The clock kept ticking, indifferent to the way time had just split into before and after. Then something inside him shifted. It wasn't heartbreak, not yet. It was clarity, a sharp, cold realization that the woman he'd loved for over 2 decades was gone. Maybe she'd been gone for a long time, and he was just too blind or too hopeful to see it. But now he saw everything. James didn't sleep that night. Instead, he sat at the kitchen table, staring at nothing as the hours bled into dawn. By morning, he had a plan. The sun had barely risen when James stood in their bedroom, looking at the place where Lena's perfume bottles still sat neatly on the dresser, her clothes hanging in the closet like silent witnesses. He didn't pack a bag. He didn't leave a note. Instead, he got to work. By noon, he'd contacted their real estate agent. The house went on the market with lightning speed, no sentimentality, just business. By evening, the joint bank accounts were emptied, the money rerouted to accounts Lena didn't even know existed. He left exactly $0 in the shared account. By nightfall, the divorce papers were signed, stapled neatly, and left on the pristine granite kitchen counter. No note, just a signature. Because, frankly, she wasn't worth the ink. When he walked out the door for the last time, he didn't look back. No hesitation. No second glance. Just like her. The morning after Lena's betrayal was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that wasn't peaceful but hollow, like a house stripped of its soul. But for James Evans, that silence wasn't emptiness. It was clarity. A man doesn't shatter overnight. He sharpens. The first light of dawn crept through the blinds, casting long, thin shadows across the bedroom walls. James stood by the window, dressed in a crisp, dark suit. One Lena had bought him years ago for an anniversary dinner she'd probably already forgotten. But today, he wore it not for her, not for anyone else. He wore it like armor. His face was calm, unnervingly so. The ache from the night before had crystallized into something cold, focused, rage refined into purpose. By 8 a.m., James was at the bank. The sterile, fluorescent-lit office smelled faintly of coffee and stale paperwork. The manager, a young man with an eager smile, greeted James with the kind of politeness reserved for clients with substantial accounts. James slid his ID and documents across the polished desk. "I need to transfer all funds from these accounts. Effective immediately." The manager hesitated, glancing at the joint accounts designation. "Mr. Evans, you're aware this is a shared account with..." James's eyes, sharp and cold, met his. "I'm aware. She'll manage." The transaction took less than an hour. Years of shared finances, vacations, anniversaries, all dissolved into a few quick keystrokes. When the manager handed him the confirmation papers, James didn't smile. "Thank you," he said curtly, pocketing the documents and walking out without looking back. Next was the house. The beautiful, 2-story suburban masterpiece he designed himself, wide windows, an open-plan kitchen, the kind of place meant to be filled with laughter and love. But it was nothing more than walls now. James called a real estate agent. Sell it. Fast. No negotiations. By the time Lena would be rolling out of some stranger's bed, their home was already listed, photos taken, paperwork processed. Step 3. The final goodbye. Back at the house, James stood in the kitchen, staring at the cold granite countertops. He placed the neatly stacked divorce papers dead center. No note. No explanation. Just a signature, bold and final at the bottom of the page. That was all she deserved. Then he left. No hesitation. No second glance. When Lena finally stumbled home the next morning, her heels clicking against the hardwood floor, she wasn't the same smug woman who'd left. Her makeup was smudged, her expression lazy and satisfied, the look of someone who believed she had control. She kicked off her shoes, expecting the usual comforts. The familiar scent of James's coffee, the soft hum of the morning news. Instead, she was greeted by emptiness. The house felt different. She frowned. walking into the kitchen. That's when she saw the stack of papers on the counter. No heartfelt plea. Just her name printed starkly on the divorce documents. "What the hell?" she whispered, flipping through the pages with trembling fingers. Her heart raced, not out of fear, but disbelief. This was supposed to be a game. James was supposed to beg, to chase after her, to fight for her attention. That was how it always worked. Panicked, she rushed to the bedroom. His clothes were gone. The drawers were empty. His side of the closet bare. She grabbed her phone and dialed his number. Straight to voicemail. Again and again. She checked their joint bank account, her fingers trembling. Balance. $0. No, she whispered, her voice rising into a sharp cry. She dialed Brooks, the man who was supposed to be her escape, her thrill. "Hey, babe," she breathed when he picked up. I need to see you." Brooks's voice was cold, indifferent. "Busy." "Brooks, please. Something's wrong." "James, he's gone. He left me." Silence. Then a laugh. Not the charming, seductive one she'd fallen for. No, this was cruel. "Wow. Didn't think he had it in him." Lena's breath hitched. "What the hell does that mean?" "It means," Brooks said lazily, "you're not as special as you thought. I got what I wanted. Maybe you should have held on to the guy who actually cared about you." The line went dead. While Lena's world crumbled, James vanished, like a ghost shedding the weight of his past. He didn't run away. No, he rebuilt. James traveled first, across cities, continents. Each new place was a step further from the man he'd been. He studied people, businesses, opportunities. Betrayal had lit a fire in him, and instead of burning out, it forged him into something new. He invested smartly, made ruthless business moves, leveraged contacts he'd once ignored. In less than a year, James Evans wasn't just an architect, he was an empire builder. His name echoed in boardrooms, not homes. His wealth grew faster than his resentment could fade. But he didn't just want success. He wanted Lena to see it, to choke on it. Back in the city, Lena's life unraveled with brutal efficiency. The house was gone. She had no money, no James to rely on, and Brooks, her wild knight, had discarded her like yesterday's news. Her days blurred into nights spent in cheap apartments, working meaningless jobs to scrape by. The same woman who once sneered at James's boring loyalty now cried herself to sleep, haunted by the echo of her own arrogance. She tried to find him, hired private investigators, searched online, but James was a ghost, his traces wiped clean. All she had left was the memory of the man she'd thrown away. The days after James's disappearance felt like an endless, suffocating void for Lena. At first, she brushed it off, confident he was simply sulking in some hotel, licking his wounds. She convinced herself he'd come crawling back, begging for another chance. But as the hours turned into days and the days bled into weeks, that confident smirk faded from her face, replaced by something she'd never felt before, fear. Lena sat on the floor of her empty apartment, her once luxurious lifestyle reduced to 4 cracked walls and the faint scent of mildew creeping from the corners. She clutched her phone like it was a lifeline, her thumb hovering over James's contact. His name still sat there, James Red Heart, a painful relic of the love she'd taken for granted. She pressed call for the 100th time. Ring, straight to voicemail. Her voice trembled, desperation seeping through every word. "James, it's me. Please, just talk to me. I made a mistake. A horrible mistake. You don't understand. I didn't mean for any of this to happen. Please, just call me back. I need to hear your voice. I need you." She ended the call and immediately hit redial. Nothing. Over the following weeks, her messages grew more frantic. "James, please. I'm sorry. I was stupid. Just tell me where you are. I miss you. I miss us. Can't we talk? Please, I'm falling apart. I deserve this, I know. But I'm begging you, James. Just one call. One chance." Each message was met with the same cold silence. James had become a ghost. No trace, no response, no closure. When Lena realized James wasn't coming back, she turned to Brooks. After all, he was the man she'd thrown everything away for. Surely he'd care. At first, Brooks played along, offering empty promises, smirking his way through her tears. But it didn't take long for the mask to slip. She found him one evening sprawled on the couch of his tiny apartment, a beer in one hand, his phone in the other, texting someone with a sly grin. "Who are you texting?" she asked, her voice brittle from exhaustion. Brooks didn't even bother to hide it. "None of your business." Lena's jaw clenched. "Is it another woman?" He finally looked at her, his blue eyes devoid of the charm that once made her weak in the knees. "So what if it is?" He stood, towering over her, the playful edge in his voice replaced with cruelty. "What did you expect? That I'd be your knight in shining armor? Please. You were just a fun distraction." The words hit harder than any slap. "But I left everything for you," she whispered, her voice cracking. Brooks chuckled darkly. "Yeah, and look where that got you. Alone. Broke. Pathetic." The weeks that followed were a spiral. Brooks drained her of the little money she had left, borrowing with promises he never intended to keep. When she couldn't give more, he grew colder, meaner. One night, after a particularly vicious argument, Brooks slammed the door behind him, leaving Lena crumpled on the floor, sobbing into the silence. Lena's descent was swift and merciless. She lost her job at the marketing firm, too distracted, too unstable to meet deadlines. The friends who once filled her phone with invites and compliments disappeared like smoke. After all, they were James's friends too, and loyalty was a currency she no longer had. She sold her jewelry, her designer clothes, even the wedding ring she'd once flaunted with pride. Each item pawned felt like another piece of her dignity slipping away. The apartment grew colder with winter's bite, the heater broken and unpaid bills stacked like gravestones on the counter. She spent nights wrapped in thin blankets, her stomach hollow from skipped meals, her heart heavier with regret than she thought possible. One night, after hours of crying herself hoarse, she stumbled into the bathroom, flicking on the harsh fluorescent light. The woman staring back from the cracked mirror was unrecognizable. Hollow cheeks, bloodshot eyes. The once vibrant Lena Evans, now just a ghost of her former self. She sank to the floor, clutching her knees, rocking slightly as the realization hit her with brutal force. James loved me, truly loved me, and I destroyed him. She thought back to the little things, James making her coffee just the way she liked, his text checking in when she worked late, the way he'd instinctively reach for her hand during movies. She remembered the anniversaries he planned with care, the random notes he'd leave in her purse. "Thinking of you, beautiful." And she remembered the look in his eyes the night she walked out. Not anger, not sadness, just finality. She'd mistaken his quiet strength for weakness. Now she understood. James wasn't weak. He was a man who knew his worth. A man who loved deeply but refused to be disrespected. And she'd lost him, not to another woman, to herself. Weeks later, in a last-ditch effort, Lena sat on a park bench with an old phone clutched in her trembling hands. Snowflakes drifted down, melting against her flushed cheeks. She scrolled through old photos, her and James smiling on vacation, at family gatherings, on lazy Sunday mornings. She dialed his number one last time, her breath fogging in the cold air. Voicemail. She spoke softly, tears slipping down unnoticed. "James, it's me. Again. I know you're never going to answer. And I don't deserve for you to. I wanted to say I'm sorry. Not because I want you back. I know that's not possible. I'm sorry because you didn't deserve what I did to you. You were the best thing in my life, and I was too blind to see it." She paused, swallowing the lump in her throat. "I hope you're happy. I hope you found someone who sees your worth, because God knows I didn't. And I'll regret that for the rest of my life." She hung up, letting the phone fall into her lap as she stared at the falling snow. No response, just silence. But this time, she knew she deserved it. The past can be a persistent shadow, no matter how fast you run from it. But for James Evans, it wasn't about running anymore. It was about building something so bright, so untouchable, that the shadows couldn't reach him. His life was unrecognizable now. The man who once stood quietly beside Lena, hidden in the shadow of her arrogance, had been replaced by someone sharper, stronger, unapologetically himself. His empire, a vast network of architectural firms, investments, and real estate holdings, stretched across cities like veins of steel. But wealth wasn't the victory. It was freedom, until he met Layla. It was a chilly evening in Manhattan. James sat in the corner of an upscale art gallery, a glass of bourbon in his hand, his tailored suit crisp and sharp. The buzz of cultured small talk floated through the air, punctuated by the occasional clink of champagne glasses. But James wasn't here for the art. He was here because solitude feels less lonely in a crowded room. That's when he saw her. Layla. She wasn't the kind of woman who tried to be noticed. She didn't need to. Her confidence was effortless. Dark hair cascading in loose waves, sharp green eyes that held stories in their depths. She stood alone, analyzing a painting with an intensity that intrigued him. Their eyes met for a brief moment. She gave a polite nod, then turned back to the canvas. James found himself moving toward her before his mind fully caught up with his feet. "That's an interesting choice," he said, standing beside her, hands in his pockets. Layla glanced at him, her expression unreadable. "Is that your way of starting a conversation or critiquing my taste in art?" James smirked slightly. She had an edge. He liked that. Maybe both. She arched an eyebrow. "Well, it's called Fractured Reflections. I find it relatable." James tilted his head, studying the painting. Shattered pieces of glass, distorted images blending into chaos. "Because life breaks us?" he asked. Layla shrugged, her gaze distant. "No, because sometimes we break ourselves." That answer hit harder than it should have. They ended up talking for hours, long after the crowd had thinned. No forced charm, no pretense. Just two people with scars, hidden beneath polished exteriors. Over the next few weeks, they met often, casual dinners, late-night walks, coffee shops tucked away from the bustling city. Layla wasn't interested in his wealth. In fact, she barely acknowledged it. She was a successful entrepreneur herself, running a consulting firm that advised startups. She had her own story of betrayal, a husband who'd cheated with her best friend, leaving her with trust issues and a bitter taste for liars. Their connection wasn't based on romance at first. It was understanding, mutual healing. One evening, sitting on a rooftop overlooking the city skyline, Layla asked, "What's your story, James? I know there's one hiding behind that mysterious businessman vibe." James stared at the lights below, silent for a long moment. Then he spoke. "Not everything, but enough. A woman I loved betrayed me. I built a life around her, thinking love was enough. It wasn't." Layla didn't pity him. She just nodded. "Yeah, people suck sometimes." That made him laugh, a genuine, unexpected laugh. For the first time in years, James felt something shift. Not love, not yet, but hope. Meanwhile, Lena's life was a study in contrast. She was living in a cramped apartment, the walls thin enough to hear her neighbors' late-night arguments. Every morning, she stared at the cracked mirror, haunted by the reflection of the woman she'd become. One day, scrolling through her phone in a haze of regret and desperation, she stumbled upon an article. James Evans, the man behind New York's fastest-growing real estate empire. She froze. There he was, James, dressed in an impeccable suit, his smile confident, standing beside city officials at a groundbreaking ceremony. He looked different, stronger, unreachable. But it was the woman in the photo beside him that made Lena's stomach twist. Layla. Lena's fingers gripped the phone tighter as jealousy flared like acid in her veins. She'd lost him, but seeing him happy with someone else was unbearable. He was supposed to be broken without me, but he wasn't. And that's when Lena made a decision, one driven not by love, but by the desperate need to reclaim what she'd thrown away. She showed up at his office unannounced. The receptionist gave her a polite, corporate smile. "Do you have an appointment?" Lena smirked, flipping her hair. "Tell James Evans's wife is here to see him." Minutes later, James's office door opened. He stepped out, his expression unreadable when he saw her. Lena's heart raced. He looked even better in person, confident, composed, completely indifferent to her presence. "James," she breathed, trying to summon the charm that once had him wrapped around her finger. His eyes were cold. Sharp. What do you want, Lena? She forced a laugh, trying to downplay the tension. Can't I visit my ex-husband without it being an agenda? James didn't smile. We both know you don't do anything without an agenda. That stung more than she expected. I saw your article. I wanted to congratulate you. You've done well for yourself. She stepped closer, lowering her voice. I've missed you. James's jaw tightened slightly, but his expression remained cool. Miss me? Or miss the life you threw away? Lena's confidence faltered. She reached out, her fingers brushing his arm. James, we had history. I made mistakes, but he stepped back, his gaze like ice. You didn't make mistakes, Lena. You made choices. And I made mine. Her eyes burned with tears she refused to let fall. So, that's it? You don't feel anything? James gave a faint, almost amused smile. Oh, I feel something. Gratitude. Because losing you was the best thing that ever happened to me. With that, he turned and walked away, leaving her standing there, just like she'd left him once. Only this time, she was the one broken. The winter winds of New York carried more than just the bite of cold. They carried echoes of mistakes, regrets, and shattered promises. For Lena Evans, each gust felt like a reminder of what she'd lost, what she'd thrown away with arrogant laughter and careless words. She was a shadow of the woman she once was. Gone were the designer dresses, the sparkling jewelry, and the smug confidence that once wrapped around her like armor. In their place, thrift store coats, worn-out shoes, and a hollow ache that no amount of pride could hide. But today, she wasn't hiding. Today, she was hunting for one last chance. It had taken her weeks to find out where James would be. He was scheduled to attend a high-profile charity gala, the kind of event Lena used to grace effortlessly. Now, she stood outside the Grand Hotel, her breath visible in the frigid air, her heart pounding like a war drum in her chest. She waited, hidden among the crowd of photographers and reporters, her eyes scanning for the man who'd haunted her every thought. And then she saw him. James emerged from a sleek black car, dressed in a tailored tuxedo that fit him like a second skin. He was more than handsome. He was regal, confident, untouchable. His arm was casually linked with Layla's, whose elegance only added salt to Lena's raw wounds. Lena's legs moved before her brain caught up. She stumbled past the flashing cameras, ignoring the startled gasps, until she was directly in front of them. "James!" she cried out, her voice cracking under the weight of desperation. He stopped. His eyes, those familiar, piercing eyes, locked onto hers. But there was no warmth in them, no flicker of recognition beyond the polite indifference one might offer a stranger. "James, please." Lena's knees buckled, and she collapsed onto the cold pavement, ignoring the sting of concrete against her skin. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Cameras clicked furiously, capturing the humiliating spectacle. Lena clutched at the hem of his coat, her tears spilling freely now. "I was wrong," she sobbed, her voice trembling. "I was so wrong. I've lost everything. Please, James, please forgive me." James looked down at her, his expression unreadable. Layla stood quietly beside him, her hand gently resting on his arm, but her gaze sharp, protective. He waited for Lena's cries to fade into hiccuping gasps before he spoke, his voice low, calm, and razor-sharp. "You didn't lose me, Lena," he said coldly. "You threw me away." The words hit harder than any slap. James gently pried his coat from her grip, his movements effortless. "Now," he continued, his eyes narrowing slightly, "live with it." Without another word, he turned and walked away, his posture straight, unbothered, as if her entire existence meant nothing. Lena remained on her knees, her sobs drowned out by the relentless clicking of cameras and the whispers of onlookers. Days later, Lena found herself in a dingy bar, nursing a cheap drink she could barely afford. The television mounted above the bar played a news segment, a recap of the gala. There was a clip of her on her knees, sobbing, while James Evans walked away without a second glance. "Billionaire James Evans ignores ex-wife's public breakdown," the headline read. Lena looked away, her stomach twisting. That's when she heard a familiar voice. Well, look who it is," She turned to see Brooks, but he wasn't the charming, cocky man she remembered. His once pristine appearance was gone, replaced by scruffy stubble, bloodshot eyes, and clothes that smelled like stale cigarettes. "What do you want, Brooks?" she muttered, her voice hollow. He slid onto the stool beside her, grinning with a bitterness that matched her own. "Just thought I'd say hi to the woman who ruined my life." "Oh, wait, you ruined yours too, didn't you?" Lena laughed bitterly, shaking her head. "At least I'm not pretending it was someone else's fault." Brooks leaned in, his breath reeking of cheap whiskey. "You know, we could have had it all, Lena. But you were too busy chasing after some fantasy. Guess you got what you deserved." "Huh?" She stared at him, realizing how pathetic he'd become, and how pathetic she was for ever thinking he was worth losing James for. Without a word, she stood up, leaving her half-empty glass behind. As she walked out of the bar, Brooks's laughter echoed after her, a cruel reminder of the choices she could never undo. That night, Lena sat alone in her tiny apartment, the silence louder than any noise. She looked around at the bare walls, the flickering light bulb, the stack of unpaid bills. She picked up her phone, scrolling through old photos of her and James. Their wedding day, vacations, lazy Sundays on the couch. "I had it all," she thought, tears blurring her vision. "And I threw it away." She typed one last message, her fingers trembling. "I don't expect a response. I just wanted you to know you were the best thing that ever happened to me. I'm sorry." She hit send. No reply came, and that was the final, cruelest consequence of all. For James Evans, revenge wasn't about rage. It wasn't about loud outbursts or heated confrontations. No, his revenge was methodical, surgical, a series of precise cuts that left his enemies bleeding long after the blade had been withdrawn. He had already turned Lena into nothing more than a distant memory, a ghost haunted by her own regrets. But there was one loose end left to tie up. Brooks Black. Brooks was desperate. Years of reckless spending, failed investments, and a reputation tainted by personal scandals had left him clinging to the edges of New York's ruthless business world. His charm had long since worn thin, replaced by desperation masquerading as arrogance. But then a golden opportunity appeared, or so he thought. A venture capitalist firm, Titan Equity Group, expressed interest in his latest business proposal, a luxury real estate development. It was his last shot at redemption, the deal that could put him back on top. What Brooks didn't know was that Titan Equity Group wasn't just any firm. It was a shell company, one of many subtly controlled by none other than James Evans. James had planned this for months, quietly pulling strings, setting traps, and watching Brooks dance right into them. The boardroom was sleek and minimalist, the large glass windows overlooking the city like silent witnesses to what was about to unfold. Brooks arrived dressed to impress, an expensive suit that didn't quite hide the desperation in his eyes. He walked in with forced confidence, his smirk rehearsed, his handshake too firm as if he could squeeze success from sheer arrogance. But when he entered the room and saw who was sitting at the head of the table, his heart sank. James Evans. Cool, collected, dressed in a tailored suit that didn't just fit his body, it fit his power. Brooks froze for a split second, masking his shock with a crooked grin. James Evans. Small world, huh? James didn't stand, didn't offer a handshake. He simply glanced up, his expression as cold as steel. "Sit down, Brooks." The command was simple, yet it carried weight. Brooks swallowed his pride and obeyed, sliding into the seat across from James. The presentation began, but Brooks's voice faltered. His confidence wavered under James's silent, unblinking gaze. James let him ramble through slides and buzzwords, pretending to care, while his mind was already at the endgame. Finally, Brooks finished, forcing a smile. "So, what do you think? A solid investment opportunity, right?" James leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. "You've always been good at one thing, Brooks, selling illusions. Whether it's to investors, women, or even yourself." The room fell silent. The other board members shifted uncomfortably, sensing the shift in tone. Brooks's smile faded. "This isn't personal, James. It's business." James chuckled softly, the sound devoid of warmth. "Oh, but it is personal. You see, I don't invest in failing projects. And I certainly don't invest in failures disguised as men. Brooks's face reddened. You think you're better than me? Just because you've got some money and a fancy title? James stood, his presence towering even without raising his voice. No, Brooks. I know I'm better than you. Because while you were busy chasing cheap thrills and burning bridges, I was building an empire. You thought you could take what was mine and come out on top. But here you are, begging for scraps at my table. The words hit harder than any physical blow. James gathered the documents from the table, tearing them in half with deliberate precision. The sound echoed in the stunned silence. This meeting is over, he said coldly, turning his back without another glance. Brooks sat frozen, humiliation burning hotter than rage. The fallout was immediate. News spread quickly in business circles. James Evans personally rejected Brooks Black's proposal. Investors pulled out overnight, and partnerships dissolved like sugar in water. Brooks's financial house of cards collapsed, leaving him bankrupt, blacklisted, and drowning in debt. His name became synonymous with failure, a cautionary tale whispered in boardrooms and business schools alike. He lost his penthouse, his cars, his so-called friends. The women who once clung to him for his charm and status vanished like smoke. Lena watched it all unfold from the tiny apartment she now called home. She read the headlines, saw the public humiliation, and felt a twisted knot of emotions, schadenfreude mixed with bitter regret. She thought about the night Brooks had charmed her, the promises he'd made, the lies he'd told. We could have had it all, he'd whispered once. But they'd had nothing, just illusions, built on fragile egos and fleeting pleasures. And then she thought of James, how he hadn't needed to shout, scream, or seek petty revenge. He'd simply lived better, smarter, stronger. His success was the ultimate revenge. James hadn't just taken their illusions away. He'd burned them to ash and built a kingdom on the ruins. Lena closed her laptop, staring at the cracked wall in front of her. She was alone. Brooks was ruined. And James was untouchable. Not because he'd hurt them, but because he'd healed without them. For James Evans, revenge had never been about satisfying a dark thirst for retribution. It was about reclaiming his narrative. The wounds left by Lena's betrayal had been deep, but they were no longer bleeding. Now, they were scars, reminders of battles fought and survived. But life wasn't meant to be lived in the shadows of the past. And James was ready to step into the light. The sun poured gently through the floor-to-ceiling windows of James's penthouse, casting golden hues over the sleek, minimalist decor. But it wasn't the luxury that filled the space with warmth. It was the sound of laughter. Layla stood in the kitchen, her hair loosely tied, wearing one of James's oversized shirts. She struggled with the coffee machine, furrowing her brows in mock frustration. James leaned against the doorway, arms crossed, a soft smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. Having a domestic crisis over there? He teased. Layla shot him a playful glare. Your fancy coffee machine hates me. It knows I'm loyal to cheap diner coffee. James chuckled, walking over. That's because you're pressing the wrong button, genius. She swatted his hand away as he tried to help. No, don't mansplain espresso to me. I got this. The machine sputtered dramatically, spraying a bit of coffee onto the counter. James raised an eyebrow. Yep, nailed it. They both burst into laughter, the sound natural and unforced. It wasn't the kind of laughter James used to fake in his old life, the polite chuckles at parties, the strained smiles and hollow conversations. This was real, and that's what Layla was to him. Real. Their relationship hadn't started with sparks or grand gestures. It had been slow, steady, a friendship that grew roots before it bloomed. They bonded over shared scars, both having been broken by people they'd once trusted. But where pain had planted seeds, healing had watered them. One evening, as they sat on the balcony overlooking the city, Layla sipped her wine thoughtfully. You ever think about her? She asked softly, not out of jealousy, but genuine curiosity. James stared out at the skyline, the city lights flickering like distant stars. Not the way I used to, he admitted. I don't hate her anymore. I just don't care. Layla nodded, understanding in her eyes. It's strange, isn't it? How people who once meant the world to us become strangers with memories attached. James looked at her then, his gaze lingering on the curve of her smile, the warmth in her eyes. She's not even a stranger, he said quietly. She's nothing. And that's the most freeing part. Layla reached over, intertwining her fingers with his. You're not just free from her, James. You're free to live now. Really live? And he believed her. James didn't just find peace and love. He found it in purpose. He invested in passion projects, not for profit, but for impact. He funded scholarships for underprivileged students, supported mental health initiatives, and even started an architecture mentorship program. Watching young talents flourish under his guidance brought him a sense of fulfillment no business deal ever had. One day, after speaking at a youth seminar, James and Layla walked through the park, the air crisp with the promise of spring. Layla glanced at him, a playful glint in her eyes. You're kind of a big deal. James laughed. Don't inflate my ego. It's already under control, barely. She stopped, pulling him by the hand. I'm serious. Look at you. You're not just surviving anymore. You're thriving. James studied her face, realizing she was right. He wasn't the man who'd been shattered by betrayal. He was a man who had rebuilt himself, not in spite of his past, but because of it. One quiet evening, James found himself alone, standing by an old wooden box he'd kept tucked away for years. Inside were remnants of his past life, wedding photos, letters, little mementos from a chapter long closed. He took out a photo of him and Lena, their smiles frozen in time. With a steady breath, he placed it in the fireplace. The flames licked the edges, curling the paper until it turned to ash. It wasn't an act of anger. It was closure. Layla entered the room, watching silently before walking over and wrapping her arms around his waist from behind. Goodbye, she whispered. James nodded. Goodbye. Months later, on a secluded beach during sunset, James knelt on one knee, holding out a simple, elegant ring. Layla's eyes filled with tears, not the broken kind they both knew too well, but tears of overwhelming joy. Yes, she whispered before he could even finish asking. They laughed, kissed, and just like that, James's new life officially began. Not as a man defined by betrayal, but as a man who found love again, not just with Layla, but within himself. Time has a cruel way of reminding people of what they've lost, not with sudden blows, but with small, relentless whispers in the quiet moments when there's no one left to drown them out. For Lena Evans, those whispers became her daily companions. They echoed in the empty spaces of her one-bedroom apartment, etched themselves into the cracks of her once flawless reflection, and haunted her in the silence between waking and sleeping. The woman who had once strutted through life with unshakable confidence now carried herself like a shadow, her arrogance replaced by the crushing weight of regret. The apartment was a far cry from the sprawling suburban home she once shared with James. The walls, stained with the faint marks of past tenants, closed in around her. The kitchen faucet dripped rhythmically, a metronome counting down the seconds of a life she could no longer escape. Lena sat at the rickety table, nursing a cheap cup of instant coffee. The bitterness was fitting. She stared at her phone, her thumb hovering over James's name in her contacts. Should I call him again? She'd asked herself that question every day for the past year, and every time, the answer was the same. He won't answer. But desperation has a way of defying logic. She hit the call button anyway. Ring, ring, voicemail. His voice was calm, professional, distant. A voice that used to whisper, "I love you now," reduced to a robotic message. She didn't leave one. She never did anymore. What was the point? One day, fate played its cruelest card. Lena was walking down Fifth Avenue, her coat pulled tight against the winter wind. Her steps slowed when she saw a familiar figure across the street, James. But he wasn't alone. Layla walked beside him, laughing at something he'd said. They looked so natural, so happy. James's hand slipped effortlessly into Layla's, their fingers intertwining like it was the most natural thing in the world. Lena froze, hidden behind a streetlight, her heart pounding, not with hope, but with the sharp sting of reality. He's happy. Without me. Her breath fogged in the cold air as she watched them disappear into a cafe, leaving her standing there, invisible, irrelevant. She didn't cry. Not then. The tears came later, when she was alone, because that's what regret does. It waits for solitude to strike. It had been months since she'd heard from Brooks Black, the man who had promised her excitement, passion, and adventure. The man she'd risked everything for. One evening, Lena found him sitting outside a rundown bar in the Lower East Side. His once charming smile was gone, replaced by hollow eyes and a face worn down by failure. His suit was wrinkled, stained with God knows what, and he reeked of cheap whiskey. Lena hesitated before approaching. "Brooks," she whispered, almost unsure if it was really him. He looked up, squinting like her face was just another bad memory trying to haunt him. "Well, if it isn't the Queen herself," he slurred, his voice dripping with bitter sarcasm. "What's the matter, princess? James didn't take you back." She ignored the jab, her gaze filled with something Brooks wasn't used to seeing, pity. "What happened to you?" she asked softly. He laughed, a dry, broken sound. "You happened. And him." He jabbed a thumb into the air, like James's ghost was standing right there. "Thought I could outsmart the man, but turns out I'm just another loser in his success story." Lena sat beside him on the cold metal bench, both of them silent for a moment, drowning in their own failures. "Do you ever think about if we hadn't?" she started, but her voice trailed off. Brooks snorted. "No. Thinking doesn't pay the bills." And with that, he stood up, stumbling away into the night, leaving Lena alone with her unfinished sentence. Back in her apartment, Lena dug through an old box she'd kept hidden in her closet. Inside were fragments of a life she couldn't reclaim. A photo of her and James on their wedding day, ticket stubs from vacations they'd taken, a love letter he'd written to her on their 10th anniversary. She ran her fingers over the faded ink, James's words once filled with warmth, now cold against her skin. "To my beautiful Lena, you're the light in my life, the beat of my heart. I don't know who I'd be without you." She crumpled the letter, tears blurring her vision. "He doesn't feel that way anymore. I'm not his light. I'm nothing to him now." Unable to stop herself, Lena grabbed her phone one last time. She knew he wouldn't answer, but this wasn't for him. It was for her. She recorded a voice message, her voice trembling. "James, I know you'll probably never hear this, and I don't deserve your time. But I just wanted to say, I'm sorry. I was selfish. I thought I was chasing happiness, but all I did was run from the best thing I ever had. I hope you're happy. I really do. You deserve that. More than anyone." She hit send without overthinking it, then dropped the phone onto the couch, her body sinking into the cushions like she was trying to disappear. The message was never read. Years passed. James's name appeared in business magazines, headlines celebrating his successes, photos of him and Layla smiling at charity events, traveling the world, building a family. Lena was just another face in the crowd, a woman with stories no one cared to hear. She grew old alone, her apartment growing colder with each passing winter. But the worst punishment wasn't her loneliness. It wasn't poverty or faded beauty. It was remembering every single day what she had and threw away. The city was alive beneath James Evans as he stood on the balcony of his penthouse, looking out at the skyline. The lights of the skyscrapers flickered like a constellation, each one a reflection of the life he had rebuilt, brick by brick, moment by moment. It was hard to imagine, sometimes, that there had been a time when this view was nothing more than a dream, one overshadowed by heartbreak and betrayal. Yet here he stood, strong, content, and at peace. Beside him, Layla leaned against the railing, her presence grounding him in a way nothing else could. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. The silence between them was comfortable, filled with years of understanding, love, and shared growth. She had seen him rise from the ashes, and now, together, they were watching the world unfold at their feet. James's thoughts drifted back to that night, the night everything had changed. Lena's words, her smug laughter, the way she had walked out with Brooks without even a second glance. He had warned her. He had begged her. But in the end, it hadn't been about proving her wrong. It had been about setting himself free. The breeze gently tugged at James's jacket, but he didn't flinch. He had grown accustomed to facing life head-on. Betrayal taught me the true value of loyalty, James muttered under his breath, more to himself than anyone else. Her loss wasn't my burden. It was her punishment. Layla, ever intuitive, turned her head to meet his gaze. Her smile was warm, understanding. You were right to let go, James. Sometimes, the hardest thing is knowing when to walk away from something that's dragging you down. James nodded, the weight of those words settling into his chest. For so long, he had carried the baggage of his past, trying to make sense of Lena's actions, trying to hold on to a relationship that had already slipped through his fingers. But time had taught him the truth. He was better off without her. He was better. It's strange, he continued, his eyes still fixed on the view. For years, I thought I needed to get revenge. I thought that's what would heal the pain. But I don't even think about her anymore. I don't carry the weight of her betrayal. He paused, looking over at Layla, the woman who had brought him peace and joy. I just live now. I'm free. Layla reached over, placing her hand gently on his arm. The connection between them was simple but strong. They didn't need words to fill the space between them. They both knew how far they'd come and how far they'd go. You deserve to be free, Layla said softly. You've earned this happiness. James smiled at her, his heart full in a way he never thought possible. I think I finally get it, Layla. Happiness isn't about revenge or revenge's aftermath. It's about living for yourself. It's about moving on, even when it feels impossible. And it's about finding someone who will stand beside you when the world feels too heavy to carry alone. Layla squeezed his hand. And you found that person? James met her eyes, and without saying another word, they shared a quiet, meaningful kiss. A kiss that felt like the culmination of everything they had been through. It wasn't the passionate, fiery kiss of a first love. It was the kiss of two people who had weathered storms together, who had rebuilt their lives from nothing, who now had everything they needed in each other. Meanwhile, 1,000 miles away, in a dingy, dimly lit apartment, Lena sat hunched over a small, battered coffee table. Her hair, once meticulously styled, now hung in disarray around her face. She looked older, tired. Her eyes were hollow, void of the spark they once held. On the table in front of her was an old, frayed photo album, one of the last tangible pieces of the life she had destroyed. Her fingers shook as she flipped through the pages. There were pictures of her and James from their younger days, vacations they'd taken, moments of happiness that felt foreign now. The laughter, the love, the promises they'd made to each other. But those moments were gone. The woman who had once had everything now found herself stuck in a prison of her own making, locked in a room of memories she couldn't escape. Lena's life had crumbled, and no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't put the pieces back together. She stopped at a picture of their wedding day. James was standing beside her, smiling down at her with so much love in his eyes. She could almost hear his voice, saying the words he had once promised. You're my everything. I'll never leave you. But those words had been shattered by her own selfishness, by the lies she had told, by the affair with Brooks that had cost her everything. Her breath hitched as she whispered, almost inaudibly, I had it all, and I threw it away. Her voice cracked as the weight of those words settled in. She had lost James. She had lost herself. She had lost everything she'd once held dear. She stood up from the table, the room spinning around her, and walked to the small, cracked mirror on the wall. Staring at her reflection, she hardly recognized the woman who looked back. The face was older, worn, with deep lines of regret etched into her skin. Her eyes were empty, nothing but a ghost of the woman who had once been full of ambition, confidence, and love. How could I have been so blind? She reached out and touched the mirror, her fingers trembling as if trying to touch the life she had once known. But there was no returning to that life. There was no undoing the damage she had done. As the days turned into months, Lena's existence became nothing more than a series of hollow routines. She worked a dead-end job that barely paid the bills. Her apartment remained a crumbling shell, and she had no friends, no family to turn to. Her calls to James remained unanswered. Her messages went unread. Every night, she fell asleep alone, haunted by the memory of the life she had lost. Back on the balcony, James stood tall, his heart full of peace. He had let go of the past. He had moved on. He had rebuilt his life from the ground up, and for the first time in a long while, he was truly content. The future stretched before him, a future built on love, trust, and the lessons learned from the past. He had everything he needed right here in Layla's hand, and in the life they were building together. And somewhere, in the distance, Lena's ghost remained, a reminder of a life he had left behind. But James had found the most important thing, peace, and that peace was all his.